Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to make 7 yards of 1/2 inch bias binding from a 20 inch by 20 inch piece of fabric. As the name bias binding suggests, it's cut on the bias, which means it's cut diagonally across the fabric. So if you were to cut strips of fabric from a yard of fabric, you'd waste an awful lot of fabric either side. So by doing it this way and joining your fabric in a special way, sewing it together, then you manage to get one continuous length, 7 yards, out of a 20 inch by 20 inch piece of fabric. And it's already joined for you, so you don't need to do any joining. So let's get started and I'll show you how it's done.
To make your own bias binding, you first need to get yourself a square of fabric. I'm cutting this square to be 20 inches by 20 inches and I'm going to be making 1/2 inch bias binding. That's 1/2 inch when folded, so I'm going to be cutting my strips at 1 inch strips. The narrower your strips, then the more you're going to make. First I cut off the selvage and then I square my fabric off to make it 20 inches by 20 inches. Then you need to cut this piece of fabric in half diagonally from corner to corner at a 45-degree angle. My rule is not quite long enough, so I'm going to cut most of it and then cut the other part. So there's the first bit done, and now I'm just going to do this last little corner at the top, and then I'll have 2 pieces of fabric cut at 45 degrees. Next we need to join these 2 pieces of fabric, so take the bottom triangle and place it on the top triangle. So take it from the bottom, just lift it over and place it on the top with right sides together, and you should end up with something looking a bit like this. In fact, looking very much like this. And then you're going to sew across the top. Pin or clip these 2 pieces of fabric together along the top edge. Then at your sewing machine, sew together, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance and back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing your pins as you go along. Then press your seam open. Lay your piece of fabric out like this on your work surface, ready to draw the lines. I am making 1/2 inch bias binding, so I'm actually cutting 1 inch strips, which will have 1/4 inch seam allowance at each side, giving me 1/2 inch bias binding. Obviously, if you want to cut wider strips, then that's fine. You can do that. I'm just, for the project I'm working on at the moment, I need 1/2 inch bias binding, so that's what I'm doing. And when you're drawing these lines, make sure that you're using a pen that won't iron off. I normally use a friction pen for my markings, but that would be no use at all for this, because once I've drawn my lines, once I've done my next seam, I'm going to have to iron. And then when I ironed, I'd remove all the marks that I've just made. So make sure that when you're doing this, you're going to be using a pen that won't rub off when you iron. I'm just normally using a normal biro pen for this. Nobody's ever going to see these marks because they'll be within the seam and you're actually going to cut on them anyway. Continue drawing your lines at 1 inch apart all the way to the top. And when you get to the top, you'll probably find that you don't have 1 inch left, or if you're doing 2 inches, you won't have 2 inches left. So whatever's left at the end, you need to cut this off if it doesn't make the right measurement, if that makes any sense. So I'm just trimming off the top here because it wasn't quite 1 inch, 1 inch wide, and that would have been no good. Lay out with right sides facing up, and then you're going to take the right hand side and join it up with the left hand side, but you're going to join from the first line, not from the end. You want to leave a little tail end. It should be a tail end of 1 inch. So here I am taking one side, taking it over to the other side. It looks like it's wrong. If you look at it now, it looks like it's wrong, but when you open it out like this, you'll realise that you've got it right. If you do that, you know you've got it right. Don't forget to leave a tail end at each end, because that's where you're going to start cutting. You're going to start cutting your bias binding from there. If you join them up level at both ends, it just won't work. So you need to join your end with your first line. And then when you pin them together, you need to make sure that the lines are meeting at the 1/4 inch mark where your seam allowance is going to be, not at the end, but at the 1/4 inch mark. So I like to put a pin in on one side and then put the pin on the other side at the 1/4 inch mark and just check that they're all lined up. Once you've lined the first one up, they all should fall into line, but it is a little bit tricky to begin with, and you must get them lined up at a 1/4 inch where your seam allowance is going to be and not right at the end. So it is a little bit tricky because you can't see and you have to keep looking over, poke your pin through and look over. But eventually, once you've got that one, the first one sorted out, as I said, they'll all fall into place. Keep pinning and matching your lines up all the way to the end. And when you get to the end, you'll end up with an overhang like you had at the beginning, and that's exactly how it should be. And this is how it should look before you sew this seam into place. So before you start sewing, just check it looks like this. Make sure you've got your overhang at each end, and then we're going to sew down the seam, again taking a 1/4 inch. So take over to your sewing machine and then sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing all those pins as you go along. Then press this seam open, and this is why you couldn't use a friction pen, because at this point you'd be ironing it all off. Now you can start cutting along the 1 inch lines that you drew. So carefully cut all the way along these lines, and you will find you just keep going round and round and round. So continue cutting all the way around until you get right to the end, and as I said, it will just all continue cutting round in one strip. You've already joined it, so you don't need to do that. And after a lot of cutting, eventually you will get to the end. If you don't have a bias binding maker tool, then you'll need to turn under each side of your bias binding tape by a 1/4 inch. You can either mark your bias binding at regular intervals, as I'm doing here, or if you don't want to do that, just use a tape measure and keep checking every so often that you're turning under a 1/4 inch. It does take rather a long time to do this. It's very time consuming, but eventually you get there. So do all of one side first, and when you've done that, mark the other side off and then do all of the second side in exactly the same way, and eventually you'll have all of your bias binding turned under on both sides. If you have a bias binding maker tool, it's a lot easier. With right side spacing down, push your bias binding through your tool, starting at the wide end to the narrow end. I use a pin to push it through. It has a hole in the top, and I use a pin to push it through and then pull it through. Your strips will already have a pointed end. If they don't, cut your fabric off at an angle, then it's much easier to thread it through. Once you've started threading it through, then you can start to iron. Slowly pull your bias binding tape tool and follow with your iron, but make sure you don't pull too far before you start to iron, otherwise it starts to unravel before you manage to iron it. So just pull it a little way at a time and make sure that you keep your fabric behind you in a nice straight line. That also helps. It's pretty easy to do. You just have to keep pulling, keeping your tail at the back straight and following along with your iron. Like I say, I don't leave much of a gap. I don't pull a great big length of it then try and iron it. I just pull about a centimetre at a time and then iron it. It's a good idea to roll your bias binding as you go along, or do like I do and put it on a piece of card so it doesn't get all tangled up as you're going along, and then it's all ready for use. And if you don't want to use it right away, you've got a way of storing it. Keep going all the way along to the end of the length of the fabric that you cut, and that's your bias binding tape already done and ready for use. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, could you please like and subscribe to my channel? Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.